Good morning. We're going to talk about a story that has to do with plants and life cycles and gardening. It's a timely story because this week on Wednesday, we celebrate Earth Day. Earth Day is April 22nd, and it's a chance for us to think about our world and what we can do to take care of it, to improve it, and to give thanks for all the beauty that God has given us in earth and in nature. This story is called The Garden of Happiness. It is written by Erica Tamar, and it's illustrated by Barbara Lambase. And it's about a girl who lives in a city. She lives in New York City, actually, and there's not really room to have a garden. And I'll show you my garden in my backyard at the end, but I live in the suburbs, so there's more space to have a garden. Where this girl lives, there really isn't room. And so some people get together and form a community garden so that they have a chance to plant vegetables that they really like to have. So we can see life cycles and we can see all the things you need to make plants grow in this story. This is the Garden of Happiness. On Marisol's block near East Houston Street, there was an empty lot that was filled with garbage and broken, tired things. It had a funky smell that made Marisol wrinkle her nose whenever she passed by. One April morning, Marisol was surprised to see many grown-ups busy in the lot. Mr. Ortiz carried a rusty refrigerator door. Mrs. Willie Mae Washington picked up newspapers. Mr. Singh rolled a tire away. The next afternoon, Marisol saw people digging up stones. Mr. Ortiz worked with a pickaxe. "¿Qué pasa?" Marisol asked. Mrs. Willie Mae Washington leaned on her shovel and wiped her forehead. "I'm going to grow me some black-eyed peas and greens and sweet potatoes too," she said, "like my daddy's farm in Alabama. No more store-bought collard greens for me." "We will call it the Garden of Happiness," Mr. Singh said. "I am planting velour. Such a beautiful vine of lavender and red. Yes, everyone is happy when they see this bean from Bangladesh." On another day, Marisol watched Mr. Castro preparing the ground. Mrs. Rodriguez rolled a wheelbarrow full of peat moss. Marisol inhaled the fresh soil smell of spring. "Oh, I want to plant something in the Garden of Happiness," Marisol said. "Too late, Nina," Mr. Ortiz said. "All the plots are already taken." So these folks are getting this empty lot ready to become a garden. So the first thing they have to do is get rid of all the stuff and get the ground ready. Marisol looked everywhere for a leftover spot, but the ground was crisscrossed by markers of sticks and string. She looked and looked. Just outside the chain-link fence, she found a bit of earth where the sidewalk had cracked. "Here's my patch," Marisol called. It was no bigger than her hand, but it was her very own. She picked out the pebbles and scraped the soil with a stick. Marisol noticed a crowd of teenagers across from the lot. They were staring at a brick wall. It was sad and closed up, without windows for eyes. Marisol crossed over to ask what they were doing. "City Arts is giving us paint to make a mural on the wall," a girl told her. "What will it be?" Marisol asked. "Don't know yet," one of the big boys said. "We haven't decided." "I'm making a garden," Marisol said. "I haven't decided either about what to plant." In the Garden of Happiness, the ground had become soft and dark. Mr. Castro talked to his seedlings as he placed them in straight rows. "Come on now, little baby things, grow nice and big for me." Marisol had no seedlings or even small cuttings or roots. "What can I do?" she thought. "Where can I find something to plant?" She went to the corner where old Mrs. Garcia was feeding the pigeons. Marisol helped herself to a big, flat seed. The birds fluttered about angrily. "Only one," she told them, "for my garden." Marisol skipped back to her patch. She poked a hole with her finger, dropped in the seed, and planted the soil all around. And every single day that spring, Marisol carried a watering can to the lot and gave her seed a cool drink. So she's planting her seed right in a crack in the sidewalk. She's giving it water, just like you have to do with plants. It sort of reminds me, if you remember the story, The Curious Garden, where plants and gardens just grew up in weird places, almost like in sidewalks. Before long, a green shoot broke through Marisol's patch. Even on rainy days, she hurried to the lot to see. Soon there were 2 leaves on a strong, straight stalk, and then there were 4. It became as high as Marisol's knee. Green things were growing all around in the Garden of Happiness. Mr. Castro's tiny seedlings became big, bushy things with ripe tomatoes shining like rubies. "Where's my plant?" Marisol asked. Now it reached to her shoulder. "What's it going to be?" "Don't know," Mrs. Willie Mae Washington answered, "but it sure is something. Try to think in your head, what do you think this plant's going to be?" Marisol pulled out the weeds in the late afternoon when it wasn't so summer hot. Sometimes she watched the teenagers across the street. They measured the wall. They talked and argued about what they would paint. Often Marisol saw Mr. Ortiz in his plot resting in a chair. "I come back from the factory and breathe the fresh air," he said, "and I sit with my little piece of Puerto Rico." "Is my plant from Puerto Rico? Do you know what it is?" Marisol asked. Mr. Ortiz shook his head and laughed. "Maybe it's Jack's beanstalk from the fairy tale." By the end of July, Marisol's plant had grown way up over her head. And then at the very top, Marisol saw a bud. It became fatter every day. She couldn't wait for it to open. "Now don't be looking so hard," Mrs. Willie Mae Washington chuckled. "It's going to open up behind your back just when you're thinking about something else." So if you've been looking at this huge plant growing, do you have a guess what it might be? Kate, my daughter who's sitting filming me, do you have a guess what it might be?
Flower.
What kind of flower?
Dandelion?
That would be a big dandelion.
A sunflower.
Yes, it's a sunflower. One morning, Marisol saw an amazing sight from halfway down the block. She ran the rest of the way. Standing higher than all the plants and vines in the garden was a flower as big as a plate. Her bud had turned into petals of yellow and gold. "A sunflower!" Mrs. Anderson exclaimed as she pushed her shopping cart by. "Reminds me of when I was a girl in Kansas." Mrs. Majewska was rushing on her way to the subway, but she skidded to a stop. "So pretty in the fields of Poland." Old Mrs. Garcia shook her head. "No, no. In Mexico, they bring joy to the roadside." "I guess sunflowers made themselves right at home in every sun-kissed place on earth," Mrs. Willie Mae Washington said. "Even right here in New York City," Marisol said proudly. The flower was a glowing circle, brighter than a yellow taxi. A flower of sunshine, Marisol thought, the happiest plant in the Garden of Happiness. All summer long, it made the people on the street stop and smile. Soon the air became cool and crisp with autumn. Mr. Castro picked the last of his tomatoes. Mrs. Singh carried away a basket full of beans. Mrs. Rodriguez picked her tomatillos. Excuse my Spanish, guys. "To dry and cut up for salsa," she said. Mrs. Willie Mae Washington dug up orange potatoes. "I can almost smell my sweet potato pie." She winked at Marisol. "I'm going to save an extra big slice for a good little gardener I know." But something terrible was happening to Marisol's flower. Its leaves were turning brown and dry. Flowers don't last forever, right? When we talk about life cycles, that's one thing we know as the seasons change. Marisol watered and watered until a stream ran down the sidewalk, but her flower's leaves began to fall. "Please get well again," Marisol whispered. Every day more golden petals curled and faded. "My flower of sunshine is sick," Marisol cried. "What should I do?" "Oh, child," Mrs. Willie Mae Washington said, "the season is over. There's a time to bloom and a time to die." "No, I don't want my flower to die." "Don't cry," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "That's the way of a garden. You must save the seeds and plant again next spring." Marisol's flower dropped to the ground. The Garden of Happiness wasn't happy for her anymore. The vines had tumbled down. The bushy green plants were gone. She collected the seeds and put them in her pocket, but spring was much too far away. Marisol was too sad to go to the empty lot anymore. For a whole week, she couldn't even look down the block where her beautiful flower used to be. The seasons keep changing. We can see it's winter. Then one day, she heard people calling her name. Marisol, come quick. Marisol, hurry. A golden haze shone on the street. There was a big crowd, like on a holiday. There was music loud and bright, and what she saw made Marisol laugh and dance and clap her hands. I don't know if anybody has made a prediction about the mural that the teenagers were painting, but here it is. They made it with all of the beautiful sunflowers that look like Marisol. So now she has her sunflower all year. So as I was reading, I hope you were thinking about some of the things we talk about in class. Since I don't have you here with me, I'm going to pull my substitute student, my daughter Kate, in to answer some of my questions. All right, so Kate, think about the story that you just heard.
Yeah.
Do you think this story is fiction or nonfiction?
Fiction.
Right. And fiction means made up, right? Now, I do think most everything in this story could have happened, although that sunflower was a little tall. But if a story could have happened, what do we call that kind of fiction?
Realistic fiction.
Yes, realistic fiction is a story, a made-up story, but it could have happened. How about the main character? Who was the main character in here?
Marisol.
Marisol. And then all the other people we heard about would have been supporting characters. How about the setting? Where does it take place?
New York City.
Right, New York City. Is there anything that you can think of, like a lesson or anything that you can kind of take away from the story about either about gardening or about life?
Take care of the earth.
Take care of the earth. That's a good one, especially for this week. Anything else? That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. So you can think about taking care of the earth and kind of giving back. Think of all that God has given you and think about putting some time into taking care of our earth or do something special for Earth Day outside. So before we go, I will show you. My garden does not look a whole lot different. I think I showed some of the second graders last week. And third graders, for you who are watching, so I'm starting a garden in my backyard. And I didn't plant a whole lot. I have some tomatoes and some herbs and some peppers. But right now, you can see out my window what it looks like. And I planted things, but what I need to do right now is go out there and clean up because you can see with some storms, some sticks have fallen in. So that right there out the window is my garden. You can see my small garden. So I hope you have a great week and get outside and enjoy Earth Day.